Punic Wars are one of the most interesting events in history, having an incredible display of determination from the Romans, and some of the greatest military tacticians in history. Carthage was a trading empire in the western Mediterranean that was originally a colony of Phoenicia, but became independent and started their own empire. They had a massive fleet of merchant ships and had control over much of the North African coast, southern Spain, and the Mediterranean islands. They fought Rome, which I'm sure you already know about, and in this and Rome had in this time period just finished conquering the Italian peninsula. The Romans called Phoenicians Punics, thus the name of the wars. Punic Wars started when Roman troops entered Sicily in 264 BC. Naval combat was dominated by Carthage, as they had lots of experience with ships, being a trade empire. Rome dominated land warfare, as Carthage had no experience with it. The Romans invented the corvus, which was essentially a giant ladder that the Romans could use to swing onto enemy ships and board them. The Roman fleet was repeatedly destroyed by storms or the Carthaginians, and they multiple times had to rebuild their entire fleet, eventually even entirely relying on donations from their upper class to keep going. Land warfare went on in Sicily, and it was a slog. The Romans besieged the main Carthaginian base on the island, and neither side accomplished anything. There was a Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca who had been effective in his guerrilla warfare, but the Romans were advancing. One of the Roman leaders, seeking glory, decided that the best course of action was to avoid Sicily was to invade Carthage itself. The Romans sent an invasion force, but were defeated by the Carthaginians, as they had hired a Spartan mercenary called Xanthippus to train their troops, and he showed them how to use their troops effectively. For example, the Carthaginians had war elephants that terrified the Romans, but they kept them at the back of their army where they were useless. The First Punic War ended when the Romans won a naval battle and started to surround the Carthaginians on Sicily, and they surrendered. Both sides were devastated, and the peace deal was very harsh. Rome annexed Sicily, and Carthage was forced to pay massive reparations. The previously mentioned Hamilcar Barca was furious and instilled a hatred of Rome into his son Hannibal. Carthage had the idea to colonize Iberia because of how much silver was located there. He sent Hannibal, and he conquered southwestern Iberia and started the flow of silver back to Carthage so that they could pay off their debt. The Second Punic War started when Carthage attacked the city of Saguntum, which was a Roman ally. The Romans and Carthaginians made a treaty which defined their spheres of influence in Iberia, and Saguntum was in the land that Carthage was granted, but Rome continued to defend them. Hannibal had the idea to cross over the Alps into Roman territory and raid their land. The Alps are the largest mountain range in Europe and difficult to cross. Crossing the Alps became an idiom for doing something really difficult, like a Hail Mary. The first battle was the Battle of Ticinus, where Hannibal's Numidian cavalry crushed the Romans. The first major demonstration of Hannibal's tactical genius came at the Battle of Trebia. First, he sent a small force to hide near the Roman camp, ready for an ambush. He then sent cavalry to provoke the Roman forces, and they ended up very tired. Hannibal's cavalry led the Romans across a river, and the Romans were cold, wet, and miserable, not in fighting condition. And at that point, Hannibal's troops, who did yet sleep and weren't tired, and didn't just march through a cold river, attacked and crushed the Romans. The next battle happened at a lake, Lake Trasimene. The enemy camp sat at opposite sides of a narrow strip of land between the lake and a ton of forest. Hannibal sent his forces into the forest, ready for an ambush, and yet again provoked the Romans into attack, as the Romans were glory-seeking and ambitious. The Romans chased the troops and got ambushed by the previously mentioned troops in the forest, and with their backs to the lake, were destroyed. Hannibal was loose in Italy, raiding farms in Roman land and forcing Roman allies to switch sides. Anytime the Romans tried to engage his forces, they were routed. The Romans did have a genius of their own. Fabius Maximus realized that if the Romans never fought Hannibal, then they couldn't lose, and eventually Hannibal would have to bring his troops back to Carthage, as he was on his own without any supply line. It was an amazing strategy studied to this day, but the rest of Roman politicians thought it was cowardly and they didn't listen. The Romans had suffered an incredible amount of casualties from these battles, but they just barely managed to scrape together an army, yet again showing how determined they were. Hannibal was outnumbered nearly 2-1 in the Battle of Cannae, but yet again he had a genius plan. He organized his troops in a semicircle formation with his weakest troops at the front, and those troops kept getting pushed back by the Romans and retreating, and this funneled the mass of Romans to the center, where the much stronger flanks of his army were ready to attack. Hannibal's superior cavalry then crushed the Romans, and the Romans' cavalry and turned around on the main Roman force and completely surrounded them. The Romans were devastated by the battle and wiped out nearly their entire army yet again. But they still managed to raise another army. And while Hannibal was rampaging in Italy, a Roman general, Scipio, had the idea to send an army to Iberia while the focus was on Hannibal's campaign. Scipio crushed the Carthaginian army at the Battle of Aleppo and seized control of Iberia and its silver mines. He then moved forward into Africa to invade Carthage itself, and Scipio and Hannibal met at the Battle of Zama, which this time was a Roman victory and Carthage was forced to surrender. Carthage was devastated. Rome came back later and fully crushed them in the Third Punic War.